The Vatican, Sumer, India, Mexico, Egypt. Same symbol. No contact. No explanation. It is a pine cone. An everyday pine cone. And for reasons art historians still debate, every major ancient civilization placed one in the hands of their gods. Never mortals, only gods. Over the next 10 minutes, we are going to trace this symbol across 5 continents and 4,000 years, not with speculation, but with the carvings themselves. Let the stone speak. Let us start where you would least expect to find a pagan symbol, the Vatican. In the Cortile della Pina stands one of the largest bronze sculptures surviving from Roman antiquity. It is a giant pine cone, nearly 4 meters tall, cast in solid bronze, catalogued by art historians since the Renaissance. This is the Pidna. It dates to the 1st or 2nd century AD. It originally stood near the Pantheon, then was moved to Old St. Peter's, and finally to this courtyard that was literally named after it. The Vatican preserved it for nearly 2,000 years. Now pause on that. The most powerful religious institution in history, which melted down countless pagan bronzes, kept this one. Why? Think about what this means. The institution that systematically replaced pagan imagery for centuries gave a giant bronze pine cone the most prominent position imaginable. As art historian Professor Paolo Liverani of the University of Florence has documented, the Pigna was deliberately moved and re-enshrined across multiple papal administrations. Here is an observation that many visitors miss. The Pina courtyard is located in a specific part of the Vatican complex. Some researchers have noted that when you overlay the Vatican layout onto a diagram of the human brain, the pine cone sits close to where the pineal gland would be. Whether this was intentional or coincidence is genuinely debated. The pineal gland, a tiny organ deep inside our brain, is literally named after the pine cone, from the Latin pinea. René Descartes called it the seat of the soul. Modern neuroscience knows it produces melatonin and regulates circadian rhythms. But the naming itself tells us the ancients noticed this resemblance. That is a documented historical fact. Let us set the Vatican aside for now and travel 4,000 years further back, to ancient Sumer, to the place where written history begins. And this is where the pattern starts to get difficult to dismiss. Across dozens of Assyrian stone reliefs, now housed in the British Museum and the Louvre, we find the same scene repeated. Tall, winged beings called Apkallu stand facing a stylized tree. In one hand, they hold a small bucket. In the other, they hold a pine cone, and they are reaching it toward the tree. This motif is one of the most thoroughly documented in Mesopotamian archaeology. It appears in Nimrud, in Nineveh, in Dosharukin. These are not minor decorations. They were carved on the walls of royal palaces and sacred temples. The British Museum alone holds over a dozen of these panels. Whatever these beings are doing with those pine cones, the Assyrians considered it worth immortalizing in stone. Notice these are not humans holding pine cones. These are divine beings, winged figures with eagle heads or human heads wearing horned crowns. In Mesopotamian iconography, as catalogued by scholars like Jeremy Black and Anthony Green, these attributes mark gods or their direct emissaries, and the pine cone is their instrument. So here is the real question: what were the gods doing with them? The standard archaeological interpretation is a purification or pollination ritual. The pine cone represents fertility, the bucket contains holy water or pollen. It is a reasonable reading, but it raises a question that even sympathetic scholars acknowledge. These are depicted as divine beings. The iconography specifically marks them as supernatural. Why would gods perform manual agricultural tasks? Now let us travel east to the Indian subcontinent, where some of the world's oldest continuous religious traditions still survive. And here, once again, we find the pine cone. Hindu deities are depicted holding objects that closely resemble pine cones. Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, is shown with pine cone-shaped elements. Temple carvings across South India and Southeast Asia, documented in surveys by the Archaeological Survey of India, show gods and divine figures holding these distinctive forms. Shiva is often depicted with a hairstyle that follows the spiral geometry of a pine cone. His third eye, the eye of inner perception, sits precisely where the pineal gland is located. The same visual correspondence the Vatican encodes in architecture, Hindu tradition encodes in sacred art. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, same object, and we are only halfway through. We are looking at 3 separate civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all independently featuring the same botanical object in their most sacred art. In comparative art history, this kind of cross-cultural convergence demands explanation, and the standard answers are still being debated. Let us cross the Atlantic Ocean to a place that, according to the archaeological consensus, had zero contact with the Old World before Columbus, Mesoamerica. In the ancient Mesoamerican world, divine figures carry staffs topped with pine cone motifs. Carvings associated with Quetzalcoatl and other deities show these distinctive forms. Mayan and Aztec relief work, preserved in museums from Mexico City to Berlin, features pine cone shapes in sacred contexts, held by beings of power, not by common people. Let that settle for a moment. No ships, no trade routes, same symbol. A civilization with no demonstrated contact with Mesopotamia, India, or Rome independently placed a pine cone in the hands of its gods. The simple fertility reading struggles here. These are creator deities in Mesoamerican cosmology. They shape worlds and birth humanity. They are not gardeners. And now civilization number 5, the oldest and perhaps the most revealing, ancient Egypt. The Egyptian god Osiris, lord of the underworld, judge of the dead, and symbol of resurrection, carries a staff, and at the top of that staff sits a pine cone. This is visible in tomb paintings from the Valley of the Kings onward. It is a clearly defined pine cone crowning the instrument of divine authority. Osiris is the god of rebirth, the god who dies and returns, and his symbol of authority is a pine cone. In a desert civilization, where pine trees do not naturally grow, Egyptologists have long noted the import of conifer resin for mummification. But the prominence of the cone itself on divine regalia goes beyond that practical use. 5 for 5, every civilization we checked, same result. 5 civilizations, 5 continents, thousands of years apart, no proven contact between most of them, and all 5 placed a pine cone in the hands of their gods, not in the hands of farmers, not in the hands of farmers, in the hands of priests, in the hands of gods. Whatever this pine cone represents, it was considered the domain of the divine. The standard fertility interpretation does not account for this consistency. So what does? To explore one possible answer, we need to go further back, before Rome, before Sumer, before recorded history. We need to look at what geology and paleontology tell us about the ancient world and its atmosphere. What follows is where observation meets hypothesis. Stay critical, stay curious. Here is what mainstream geology confirms. During earlier geological eras, atmospheric conditions were significantly different. Oxygen levels were higher, the atmosphere carried more moisture. These conditions supported the gigantism visible in the fossil record: enormous insects, massive reptiles, towering flora. This is textbook paleontology. The denser atmosphere is what allowed the gigantism we see in fossils. Dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, giant marine reptiles. The richer atmosphere literally supported larger organisms, but it also may have created something else, something worth considering. A denser atmosphere with high moisture content is an electrically active environment. We observe this today. Static electricity is strongest in humid conditions. The phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire appears on ship masts when atmospheric density and humidity increase. Atmospheric scientists study these effects. Now consider an entire atmosphere at greater density, sustained over geological time. Keep this in mind. We are going to connect it to the pine cone in about 60 seconds. Nature already knows how to harness electricity. Electric eels generate 800 volts. Electric rays exist across every ocean. These are living organisms producing electrical output without metal conductors. Biology solved this engineering problem millions of years ago. Plants use electricity too. The Venus flytrap snaps shut using electrical impulses. The sensitive mimosa folds its leaves through electrical signaling. Published research in journals like Plant Physiology shows that electrically stimulated seeds germinate faster. Life and electricity are deeply intertwined. Now we arrive at the central hypothesis. We know ancient flora was enormous. Fossil evidence of massive ferns and trees is well established in paleobotany. Some researchers have proposed that in conditions of higher atmospheric density, ancient conifers could have grown to extraordinary sizes, far larger than anything alive today. Now combine those two ideas. Giant conifers, electrically charged atmosphere. Watch what happens. An atmosphere charged with electricity and trees reaching into the cloud layer. What happens is basic physics, the same principle behind the lightning rod. A tall conductive structure in an electrically active atmosphere would discharge that atmosphere. Energy flows down the tree and into the ground, continuously, a smooth, constant flow of energy. If these trees channeled electricity, they needed a medium for charge to flow. Conifers already have one, resin. An ancient resin was remarkably different from what we see today. Look at amber, the fossilized resin from ancient trees. Inside amber, we find perfectly preserved insects with undamaged wings. Recently, a dinosaur tail was found preserved in amber, published in Current Biology. This means ancient resin was extraordinarily fluid, fast enough to envelop a flying insect before it could escape. That fluid resin would have been a far better electrical medium than what modern pines produce. And here is a detail hiding in plain sight. The Greek word for amber is electron. It is literally where the word electricity comes from. Conifer resin derivatives remain essential to modern electronics. Rosin, derived from pine resin, is indispensable for soldering circuit boards. Turpentine serves as an electrical insulator. The industrial relationship between conifer resin and electrical engineering is not ancient law, it is present-day manufacturing. So now we have a hypothesis: gigantic conifer trees acting as natural conductors, channeling atmospheric electricity through fluid resin, a living electrical infrastructure. But where does the pine cone fit? This is where the idea becomes genuinely elegant. Look at the structure of a pine cone. It is layers of thin scales arranged in a Fibonacci spiral, separated by small gaps. Now look at the structure of an electrical capacitor. It is layers of thin plates separated by a dielectric material. The geometry is strikingly similar. A pine cone is structurally a natural analog to a capacitor. Its architecture is suited for storing electrical charge between its layers. Think about that. The shape the ancients revered most is the shape that stores charge best. Every fruit exists to give its seed the best possible start. Apples provide sugar, coconuts provide water, avocados provide fat. Each fruit packages exactly what the seed needs. So what does a pine cone provide? Very little flesh, minimal sugar, mostly thin, hard scales arranged in precise geometric spirals. What if the pine cone's original purpose was not to store nutrients, but to store energy? Electrical energy, harvested from the atmosphere through the tree's trunk and concentrated in the cone's capacitor-like structure. The seed inside would germinate not with sugar, but with a charge, an electrical jumpstart for new growth. And here is a detail that rewards close observation. Look at every ancient depiction of a pine cone, in Sumer, in Rome, in Egyptian art. Every single one shows the pine cone closed, with its scales pressed tightly together. Modern pine cones on a forest floor are almost always open. That is not a trivial detail, that is a clue. A pine cone opens when it releases its seeds. If the ancients valued pine cones for their seeds or for pollination, they would logically depict them open, in the act of dispersal, but they always depicted them closed, sealed, full, as if the value was in what the closed cone contained, not the seeds, something else. Consider what we know about static electricity. When charge accumulates on your body, your hair stands up. Individual strands repel each other and separate. Now picture a pine cone accumulating charge. Its scales would be held together by the field. As the charge dissipates, the scales relax and open. A charged cone is closed. A spent cone opens. In electrical engineering, there is an ongoing discussion about where charge is actually stored in a capacitor. Research suggests it resides partly in the dielectric material between the plates. In a pine cone, that dielectric would be the resin between the scales, the same resin that produces amber, the same amber that gave us the word electricity. Now go back to the Sumerian reliefs with fresh eyes. The winged beings holding pine cones toward the tree of life. Under this hypothesis, we are not looking at a fertility ritual. We are looking at a depiction of an electrical process, beings managing, maintaining, or harvesting energy from enormous living trees. The bucket is not holy water, it is a vessel for the charged resin. And the tree of life itself, the most sacred symbol in Mesopotamian religion, what if it was not purely metaphor? What if it encoded a memory of a real tree, an enormous conifer that channeled atmospheric energy, a tree that sustained its ecosystem through the electrical energy it distributed, a tree worth remembering for millennia? The world tree appears across virtually every ancient mythology: Yggdrasil in Norse tradition, the Bodhi tree in Buddhism, the Kalpavriksha in Hinduism, the tree of knowledge in Genesis, the Mesoamerican world tree, all described as a colossal tree connecting earth and sky, associated with wisdom, energy, and life. Comparative mythologists like Mircea Eliade have written extensively about this cross-cultural motif. Every living organism runs on electricity. Nerve impulses are electrical signals. Muscle contractions are triggered by charge. Brain function is entirely electrical. Galvani's experiments with frog legs prove that electricity animates tissue. The connection between life and electricity is not fringe, it is the foundation of neuroscience. So picture the hypothesis in full: an atmosphere denser than today, saturated with moisture, electrically active, and towering above the landscape, forests of massive conifers channeling energy from sky to earth, storing it in pine cones. Under this reading, the tree of life was not metaphor. It was memory, a living electrical infrastructure. And its fruit, the pine cone, was the most concentrated source of stored energy in that world. And then that world ended. Whatever happened, whether it was an impact event, a shift in orbital dynamics, or geological upheaval, the atmosphere changed, it thinned, the moisture dissipated, the electrical density dropped, and with it, the conditions that sustained those enormous trees vanished. Without the dense atmosphere, the great conifers could not survive. Their resin thickened. Their electrical function, if it existed, ceased. The great trees fell and became what we now find as fossils, coal seams, and petrified forests. And without large-scale conductors to gently ground the atmospheric charge, a new phenomenon would have emerged: lightning. The violent, uncontrolled discharge we see today. Under this framework, every thunderstorm is evidence of an electrical system without its conductor network, an energy grid that lost its infrastructure. The survivors of any such catastrophe would have remembered the trees. They would have remembered the pine cones. They would have understood these as the most important objects in their world, and they would have passed this memory forward through generations, through oral tradition, through art, through architecture. But as millennia passed, the literal memory faded. Descendants no longer knew what the giant trees were. They only knew their ancestors revered a cone-shaped form held by powerful beings. The memory became myth. The observation became religion. The Sumerians carved winged beings holding pine cones because they preserved the memory of those who once managed this infrastructure. The Egyptians placed a pine cone on Osiris's staff because it represented life-giving energy. Hindu tradition connected it to the third eye because they retained the association with the brain's own electrical regulator, the pineal gland. Mesoamerican civilizations, separated by an ocean, held the same motif. Their gods carried pine cone staffs. If this hypothesis is correct, it would be because the same event happened everywhere. The same trees fell everywhere. The same loss was felt by every surviving culture on the planet. And the Vatican, the institution that inherited Roman traditions, which drew from Greek traditions, which drew from Egyptian and Mesopotamian ones, they kept the piña because it arrived through an unbroken chain of cultural inheritance. Whatever its original significance, it was considered worth preserving across every era of Western civilization. Consider the Vatican's design once more. The Pigna courtyard's possible correspondence to the pineal gland's position in the brain. The pineal gland is the brain's own light-sensitive regulator, controlling circadian rhythms through melatonin. It responds to the electromagnetic spectrum. The ancients named it after the pine cone. Whether by design or by inheritance, the parallel is there. So where does this leave us? Let us weigh it honestly. Let us review the evidence honestly. A symbol that appears independently in at least 5 major civilizations, always associated with divine figures, always depicted closed, structurally analogous to a capacitor, named after the brain organ that regulates our electrical rhythms, preserved by the most enduring institution in Western history. These are documented observations. The electrical interpretation is hypothesis, but it fits the observations remarkably well. Is there definitive proof? No. But as archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler once said, the archaeologist is not digging up things, he is digging up people. Symbols tell us what people valued, and this symbol was valued more consistently across more cultures than almost any other in human history. What we do have is this: a symbol so important that 5 separate civilizations carved it in bronze and placed it in the hands of their highest beings. A symbol that survived longer than any empire, any language, any religion, staring at us from every ancient wall, waiting for us to ask the right question. The next time you walk through a forest and see a pine cone on the ground, pick it up, feel its weight, look at the Fibonacci spiral of its scales, and ask yourself, is this just a seed pod, or is it an echo of something we have not yet fully understood? 5 civilizations carved the same symbol because it mattered more than anything else they knew. And when the world that gave it meaning ended, the memory endured. Carved in stone, cast in bronze, encoded in architecture, hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. If there are flaws in this reasoning, point them out in the comments. That is how we sharpen ideas. But if this investigation made you look at the ancient world differently, if it made you notice a pattern you had not seen before, then we asked a question worth asking, and that is always where